The year is 1979. The setting isn't a gleaming Wall Street boardroom, but a humid room in Dallas, Texas. The air is thick with the smell of cheap hamburgers and expensive cigars. At the center of the table sits Nelson Bunker Hunt. To the untrained eye, Bunker looks like a man who stumbled out of a discount clothing bin. He is disheveled, overweight, and wears glasses that seem to magnify a permanent look of suspicion. But appearances are the first lie of this story. Bunker Hunt and his brother Herbert are, at this moment, the wealthiest men on earth. They are oil barons. But they have a problem that keeps them up at night, sweating through those cheap suits. Their money is melting. In the late 70s, inflation was the invisible fire burning down the American economy. The dollar was losing value every single day. Imagine holding an ice cube in your hand. The longer you hold it, the less of it you have. That was cash in 1979. The Hunts looked at their billions sitting in the bank and didn't see wealth. They saw a shrinking pile of paper. They decided they needed an anchor. Something real, something heavy, something that couldn't be printed by a bureaucrat in Washington. They chose silver. Now, let us open the archives and dissect the anatomy of this failure. Most people, when they want to invest in silver, might buy a few coins or a nice tea set. The Hunts didn't want a slice of the pie. They wanted to buy the bakery, fire the baker, and lock the doors. They began an aggressive campaign to corner the market. In the language of finance, cornering is exactly what it sounds like. It's the schoolyard bully strategy. If you buy every marble in the schoolyard, eventually, anyone who wants to play has to come to you, and you get to decide what a marble costs. The brothers started buying. First, they bought physical silver, actual bars and coins. They bought so much that they had to charter private Boeing 707 jets just to fly the bullion to secure vaults in Switzerland. They were moving metal by the ton, creating a shortage in the real world. Kodak, which needed silver to make film, couldn't find supplies. Dentists couldn't find silver for fillings. But buying the physical metal wasn't enough to satisfy their hunger. They needed more leverage. They turned to the futures market. This is where the story shifts from a shopping spree to a casino. A futures contract is sophisticated jargon for a very simple bet. It is a promise to buy something at a specific date for a set price. It's like telling a farmer, I will buy your entire corn harvest next September for $10,000, regardless of whether the price of corn goes up or down in the meantime. Usually, these contracts are just paper shuffling. Traders swap them back and forth to make a quick buck, never actually intending to take delivery of the corn, the oil, or the silver. They are betting on the price, not buying the product. The Hunts broke the unwritten rule. They bought the contracts, and when the contracts expired, they looked the sellers in the eye and said, "We don't want the cash equivalent. We want the metal. Deliver it." Panic swept through the exchanges. The sellers didn't have the silver. They had sold promises they couldn't keep, assuming the Hunts would settle for cash. Now, these sellers had to run into the open market and buy silver at any price to fulfill the contract. This created a feedback loop of pure hysteria. The more the Hunts demanded the metal, the scarcer it became. The scarcer it became, the higher the price rose. In early 1979, silver was trading at around $6 an ounce. By January 1980, it had smashed through the ceiling, hitting nearly $50 an ounce. The Hunts were ecstatic. On paper, they had turned their billions into super billions. They controlled nearly 2/3 of the world's privately held silver. They believed they had beaten the system. They believed they were the smartest men in the room. But they had forgotten the most important rule of the casino. The house always wins. They were playing poker against the U.S. government and the regulators of the exchange. And while the Hunts had the chips, the regulators owned the table. And they were about to change the rules of the game in the middle of the hand. To understand how two men could bring the global financial system to its knees, we have to look under the hood of their engine. We have to talk about leverage. The Hunts were rich, yes, but they weren't by all the silver in the world rich. To achieve their monopoly, they didn't just spend their own money. They borrowed massive amounts of capital to do it. In the financial world, this is called buying on margin. Think of it like buying a house. You put down a 20% down payment, and the bank lends you the other 80%. If the house goes up in value, you make a profit on the entire house, not just your down payment. It is a magical multiplier of wealth. But there is a trap door. If the value of the house drops, the bank doesn't just shrug. The bank gets nervous. They call you and say, "The asset backing our loan is shrinking. Give us more cash to cover the difference." Right now, this is the dreaded margin call. The Hunts had bought millions of ounces of silver on borrowed dime. They had put down a sliver of cash to control a mountain of metal. As long as the price of silver kept climbing, everyone was happy. The bank saw the Hunts as geniuses. The Hunts saw themselves as kings. But the regulators, the people who run the commodity exchanges in New York and Chicago, saw them as a virus. By January 1980, with silver at $50, the jewelry industry was decimated. Photography companies were laying off workers because they couldn't afford film. The little guy was suffering so the Hunts could get richer. The board of governors at the COMEX, the main metal exchange, decided enough was enough. They didn't just ask the Hunts to stop. They didn't send a polite letter. They nuked the market. They changed the rules of the game while the game was still being played. First, they put limits on how much silver any single person could hold. The Hunts ignored this, using shell companies and family members to hide their positions. So, on the 21st of January 1980, the exchange played their ace card. They implemented Silver Rule 7. This rule was simple, brutal, and effective. It declared that from this moment forward, traders could only sell silver. Buying was banned. Stop and imagine that for a moment. You are at an auction house. The room is hot. People are shouting, "The price is rising." Suddenly, the auctioneer slams his gavel and locks the doors. He announces, "No one is allowed to place a bid. You can only sell what you have." If no one is allowed to buy, what happens to the price? It has nowhere to go but down. The market froze. The demand vanished instantly because it had been legislated out of existence. The price of silver didn't just dip, it collapsed. It fell from $50 to $34 in days, then to $25, then to $15. This triggered the trap door we spoke of earlier. The leverage that had fueled the Hunts' rise now became the weight dragging them to the bottom of the ocean. The banks that had loaned the Hunts billions suddenly realized their collateral was evaporating. They picked up the phone. Mr. Hunt, silver is down. You owe us $100 million in cash to cover the margin. The next day, Mr. Hunt, it dropped again. You owe us another $200 million. This is where the difference between wealth and liquidity becomes a matter of life and death. Liquidity is like water in the pipes of your house. It flows. It's cash you can spend right now. Wealth is the house itself. It has value, but you can't buy groceries with a brick from your chimney. The Hunt brothers had immense wealth. They owned oil fields, cattle ranches, ancient Greek statues, and millions of ounces of silver. But they had almost no liquidity. They were asset rich, cash poor. They were like a man dying of thirst in a room full of gold bars. You cannot drink gold. And the banks didn't want oil fields. They wanted cash, and they wanted it by 2 p.m. The tension broke on the 27th of March 1980, a day that would go down in history as Silver Thursday. The price of silver plummeted to $10.8 million an ounce. The Hunts missed a massive margin call. They simply couldn't pay. Panic spread from the commodities pits to Wall Street. The fear was systemic. If the Hunts defaulted, the brokerage firms that lent them money would collapse. If the brokerages collapsed, the banks that backed them would fall. It was a domino chain that threatened to wipe out the entire U.S. financial system. The chaotic scene on the trading floor was pure noir. Men in sweat-stained shirts screaming orders, phone lines jammed, the ticker tape lagging behind the carnage. The Hunts sat in their Dallas headquarters, watching their empire dismantled quote by quote. They had tried to corner the market, to squeeze the world. But the world squeezed back. The regulators had rigged the game to force a crash, and the leverage had turned that crash into a personal apocalypse for the brothers. The illusion of control was gone. All that remained was the debt. The aftermath of Silver Thursday wasn't a negotiation. It was a hostage exchange. The hostage was the American economy. The kidnappers were the Hunt brothers' bad bets. And the negotiator was Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man who looked at inflation the way a Terminator looks at a target. Volcker understood that if the Hunts went under, they would drag the banks down with them. So, over a tense weekend, a deal was struck in the shadows. A consortium of banks agreed to loan the Hunts $1.1 billion. This sounds like a victory, doesn't it? Getting $1 billion loan after you just broke the market? But this wasn't free money. It was a mortgage on their souls. To secure that loan, the Hunts had to pledge everything. They didn't just sign a paper. They had to back up a moving truck to their lives. They mortgaged their oil fields. They mortgaged their cattle ranches. They handed over the deeds to their real estate. They even had to pawn their personal collections, ancient Greek vases, 600 thoroughbred horses, and yes, the mountains of silver that had started the trouble. They were stripped clean. The brothers spent the next decade in courtrooms and bankruptcy hearings. At one point, Nelson Bunker Hunt, once the richest man in the world, had to ask a judge for permission to spend money on a new suit. His net worth had dropped from nearly $10 billion to negative $1.5 billion. The silver they had bought at $30, $40, and $50 an ounce sat in vaults, gathering dust, worth only $5. The illusion of the corner was shattered. The Hunts had tried to force the world to value silver at a price the world refused to pay. They forgot that a price is just an agreement between a buyer and a seller. If you force the price up with manipulation rather than real demand, you aren't building value. You are building a bubble. And bubbles, by their very nature, are destined to pop. The verdict of history on the Hunt brothers is often that they were greedy. But greed is common. Their sin wasn't greed. It was arrogance. They believed they were bigger than the market. They believed that because they had money, they could rewrite the laws of supply and demand. They treated the global economy like a private toy, unaware that the mechanism is designed to crush anyone who tries to stop the gears from turning. They learned the hard way that in the financial world, you are never the owner of the casino. You are just a player at the table. And when the house decides you've won too much or played too recklessly, they don't just ask you to leave. They take your chips, they take your watch, and they show you the door. The tragedy of the Hunt brothers is a reminder of the seduction of the sure thing. We all want to find that one asset, that one trick that will protect us from the uncertainties of the world. We look for anchors in the storm, whether it's silver, real estate, or the latest tech stock. We convince ourselves that this time is different. But the mechanism of the market is ruthless in its efficiency. It tolerates speculation, but it destroys monopoly. It invites you to bet, but it punishes you for trying to rig the wheel. The Hunts wanted to own the silver to protect their wealth from fading away. Instead, the silver became the anchor that drowned them. They fought against the invisible hand, and the invisible hand slapped them down. So, the next time you see a price skyrocketing to the moon, or a genius claiming they have cornered the market, remember the two brothers from Texas who tried to buy the world. Remember the empty vaults and the auction blocks. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.